Right, well, as Rebecca's just said, I'm Dr. Stephen Thornton. I'm around here, from around these parts. And please, just indulge me, if you will, because I'm going to use this kind of keynote to trot fairly swiftly through, as Rebecca has alluded, rather scarily, 20 years worth of doing, writing, musing, sometimes whining about attempts to encourage information literacy in the politics classroom. This talk is loosely based on a paper I gave a few months ago at the UCL Politics of Pedagogy seminar series. But there was one big difference. Back then, the crowd was mostly politics academics, particularly those interested in pedagogy. You are obviously a very different crowd. With the politics lot, I am the information literacy guy. I could say, and probably did, almost anything and get away with it. You, however, I suspect will spot fairly quickly that I'm actually a bit of a chancer when it comes to all this. But I hope a chancer with an interesting story to tell. And that story is of a very much non-specialist, non-information specialist. As some in this room will know very well, I can barely turn my computer on. But I am somebody who takes information literacy seriously, even if sometimes he's not quite sure precisely what information literacy actually is. So to start my story, yes, come with me, if you will, to the early days of this century. These were, my salad days as a politics lecturer, which largely meant running lots of first-year seminars and marking lots and lots and lots of essays. And I began to notice something slightly weird happening. Students were not simply using material that had been listed lovingly on their reading lists. They were going off-piste, which even then, to be fair, I didn't have a problem with. If a student can find marvellous, relevant stuff without that type of guidance, then, great, wonderful. But the thing was, of course, much of this stuff was not wonderful. It wasn't suitable, appropriate for an academic essay, put it that way. Most of the stuff was like this. I actually found this in my office a few days ago. Been lurking there since 2006, it would appear. It's like those last two. Does that help? Did that make a good essay? Not particularly. I do apologise, that actually is my writing. I must have been doing an awful lot of marking in those days. A bit messy and short, question mark, apostrophe, whatever. So, what to do with this problem? I do apologise already. It so happened, back then, in those early days of this century, that this youngish politics lecturer, with then a full head of hair, was married to a glamorous librarian. So he mentioned his concerns to her about, where students were getting their information from. And so this glamorous librarian wife suggested that I looked into a special concept, one that was making waves in what was to me the hugely exotic world of the information professional. A concept designed for this very problem, of course, this being information literacy. Well, this was, as they didn't say back in 2005, a game changer. Here was my answer. I just had to get the students to be information literate, and myself for that matter. And of course, in those innocent days, to be information literate largely meant the old American Library Association definition. Information literacy is a set of abilities requiring individuals to, all together now, recognise when information is needed and have the ability to locate, evaluate and use effectively the needed information. It's like the Lord's Prayer, isn't it, in this group? But, and for the most part, I guess in those days, information literacy was conceptualised as a skills, a stroke abilities-based concept. I certainly saw it that way, at least. In other words, we just needed to, my students and myself, needed to get properly tooled up, and we'd be ready for action. We could take on the world. And I was so thrilled about this discovery that as soon as I could, I introduced some information training, I'll use that word, into various modules on which I was involved. And those involved, obviously, I asked for help, and those from the library came to my rescue, as they have done so many times these last 20 years. In the early days, people like Kathy Jackson, Tom Dawkes, as a blast from the past for some people here, Sonia Hirkinen, Rebecca Mogg, as has been mentioned, Louisa Tramontini, and of course, Ruth Thornton, who started this off. And I'm delighted to say some are on the room today, and most are still speaking to me, which is nice. But to be serious, I mean, and this has been probably one of the few common themes throughout all my work. It has been the importance of collaboration between what American friends call faculty, I suppose people like me, and information professionals, all engaged as equal partners in a common enterprise. Right. So back to the story. Following this Damascene revelation around 20 years ago, I did some work showing that there were strong connections between the attributes of a successful student of politics and international relations, at least as expressed through the QAA benchmark statements at the time, and also qualities associated with those deemed to be information literate, in this case via the Sconnell 7 Pillars model. Fun times. And with that as evidence, and with obviously a lot of help from the library, I then introduced some explicitly information literacy-related assessments into some politics modules. And nobody tried to stop me. And having rooted out a very old conference paper, apparently they look like this. Or a bit of it anyway. In those days, we called them reflective research trails, and the goal was to get the students to reflect on the sources that they had used in a politics essay they had just written. So, usual questions. Where did you find them? What did they add to your essay? All that kind of stuff. Oh yeah, a bit of Web of Knowledge, JSTOR, and all that kind of malarkey. So I was pumped up, and I wrote a series of articles about my experiences. And looking back, the enthusiasm, at least, is touching. As I wrote at the end of one of these early pieces, I quote, "The information revolution is not confined to the library. It promises to challenge the orthodoxies of all subjects, and those outside the world of the information specialist need to be aware of this." However, looking back on some of this material, I perhaps should have seen some signs that not everybody was quite as enthusiastic as me. And yeah, returning, the feedback from the students was mostly positive, it's got to be said. We did quite a few post-test surveys in those days. But looking back at it this time, I did notice that we asked one question, I actually asked for suggestions about how the research trail could be improved. And it is telling that one student wrote, eradication. And others, and this actually seriously does tap into the theme about how study skills are often perceived by students and others, suggested that the time and effort involved in writing the research trail meant, I quote, a sacrifice in the far more relevant activity of writing the associated essay. So there's that. And generally, it's got to be said that the world did not change. The revolution was not only not televised, it didn't actually happen. But I kept plugging away at it, both in class with the students, of course, and at sparsely attended political association conference panels. But it's got to be said, by this stage, that initial spark was beginning to glow less brightly. Nevertheless, through most of the second decade of this century, I maintained a habit of giving students on my first year module a questionnaire that tried to provoke responses that gave some impression of their information competencies as they were in their first weeks and months at university. It asked questions like this: what, if any, criteria do you use to assess whether a website contains information reliable enough to use in your assessed work? And these are the kind of responses I got. And I got enough responses to, well, these responses I used as fodder for a series of articles. And after a while, I was able to actually compare them, which is quite useful. But it was a little bit boring, let's be honest. And I think I was even boring myself by this stage. The conclusion of an article published at the end of the decade ran rather wearily with this quote: though some students in 2017 did demonstrate solid levels of information literacy in many fields, including ethical aspects, the surveys also provided little indication that, in general, these particular students were any more discerning users of information in their academic work than they were back in 2009. Nor was there evidence that students were significantly bolder about their information choices. Indeed, the willingness and ability of many students to grapple with a variety of electronic repositories of information, other than the obvious one, Google, seems to have diminished. So that, I've been at this by this stage about 15 years. Basically, the problem, as I perceived it, saw it seemed to be as bad as ever, in fact, in some ways worse. And I didn't feel as though I could do anything about it. The light had effectively gone out by this stage. And beyond this frustration, there were two additional factors that were kind of adding to my dark gloom. Yes. The first of these was a problem that I saw in the way that information literacy was developing as a concept. Now, I realise there's a little bit of a risk coming here, addressing you lot, and saying there's a bit of a problem with your concept. But it is an honest reflection of how I felt at the time. I did write about it in an article. And the point was, as you all know, information literacy has always been more than simply a list of skills to tick off. It has always included a critical element. But over time, it seemed that critical element in the literature seemed to be taking perhaps more prominence than the information bit, if you see what I mean. And perhaps even more concerning, or worrying for me at least, was that the claims being made were increasingly ambitious. In the tradition of Paulo Freire, promises were made that information literacy could, reverse trends of exclusion and generally empower people. Empowerment was a term that was used a lot. That worried me a bit, even then. Can I actually empower people? Just by... Anyway. And I do get it, obviously. There are massive issues with power dynamics, Google, the dominance of certain publishing houses, and yes, our own biases as librarians and academics. I get it, I've taught power. I've done Stephen Luke's and all those dimensions and so forth. But I felt, for most academics at least, those are not critical theorists anyway, that's all very well, but in most cases that's not what we really wanted in the classroom. We just wanted to help our students become better scholars. And let's be honest, in as simple a way as possible. We felt as though we didn't have the time or the energy to save the world, which is clearly what some of the literature was suggesting we should be trying to do. And in addition to all that, this was the time of the proliferation of literacies. Your media literacy, digital literacy, news literacy. I even have seen relatively recently ChatGPT literacy. And that didn't help in many respects. It just muddied the water. Oh, so yeah, this is the paradox, as I kind of, it's not quite the words I used back in 2012, but that's the kind of gist. The more sophisticated it was becoming as a concept, ironically, the more perhaps academic it was becoming, I felt it would get less likely it was going to get used, in most cases, by most academics. And this is even the case with politics academics. Obviously, a lot of us look at power dynamics, but we tend to do it within the context of our own curriculum, our own module. And the rest of us are busy trying to explain, I don't know, why a federal model of government is different to a devolved system of government, or something equally interesting. So yeah, you may want to come back to me about that. I don't know. So there's that. So there's that paradox which I couldn't resolve. Because let's be honest, I did actually like the fact that information literacy was becoming more interesting, more sophisticated, more academic. Dare I say it, more sexy. But it actually didn't help me in my day-to-day routine job. If you see, yeah. Anyway, so I've got frustration, I've got confusion, and the final thing that was causing me a bit of a problem at the time, guilt. And to some extent, I guess this was linked to the rise in what we now call critical information literacy, or the advocacy of it at least. There were suddenly quite a few pieces that suggested what we, perhaps less critical folk, were doing was not just pointless, but actually possibly damaging. In light of certain developments in the US, Barbara Pfister wrote, "Information literacy advocates must acknowledge that focusing on how we find and evaluate information is not sufficient and may, if taught ineffectively, actually be harmful." And in another thought-provoking article, Alison Hicks, who I think is here, and Anne-Marie Lloyd suggested another issue, one which argued that there were two common but conflicting narratives within much information literacy-related literature. One narrative suggests student empowerment, but that jars with another narrative that portrays students as unmotivated, immature, and occasionally unethical. And it's a narrative that positions information literacy instruction as a form of victim blaming. And, I could see that in some of my own work. You've just seen it before. That shocked me. So I don't want to harm my students. They have enough worries. So, yeah. I was going to give up, to be honest. That 2019 article was going to be the last one. But I found new light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, that could, of course, be the train coming the other way, but I hope not. The first, factor in this seeing the light again was this chap here, Doug Atkinson, a former colleague of mine here at Cardiff. At some meandering research meeting or other, we did the usual stuff about talking about, what we did. And I mentioned, coyly by this stage, the information literacy dimension that I do. And then something truly remarkable happened. Doug seemed interested. And I don't normally get that from political scientists, particularly with those with a background in quantitative research, at least. And we chatted some more, and it became evident that, particularly with Doug's mighty skills as a data analyst, we could look afresh at information literacy in the politics classroom, do different types of work. And this we've done. We've also taken a more back-to-basics approach some sense of providing a degree of evidence to support some basic assumptions. So, for an example, do politics students who show more advanced levels of information literacy actually do better in their academic work? You'd hope so, I guess. Particularly as there are clear links between the attributes of a successful political scientist and somebody who's regarded as information literate. And yet, as far as I know, nobody had actually tried to show it this translated in the real world. And so this was our first bit of research together. We conducted a citation analysis of 262 first-year essays submitted for my first-year foundation module on comparative politics. And we used this information to test this hypothesis that the more citations that are used that we dubbed of higher quality that appeared in an essay, the more likely that essay would achieve higher marks. This, of course, does provoke questions as to what constitutes higher quality resource, but let's put that to one side for the time being. And so in detail, and for goodness sake, don't ask me questions about this. This is mostly Doug. It's got numbers involved. I think I just about understand what's going on here. Doug found, that for every one textbook citation, holding all other variables at their means, a student received an additional 0.613 points on their score. Effectively, if you use an additional textbook, you get roughly half an extra point. So rather than 60, you get 60.5, I guess. I told you maths isn't my strong point. Similarly, for an additional journal article, the student received, there'll be an associated increase of 0.977 in the score the essay received. Basically, they get one whole extra mark for each journal article they cited. That's quite significant. That is significant. Even Doug said that's significant. In terms of a monograph, we're looking at a 0.663 increase. So a bit down on textbook, interestingly. This was the surprise. A citation from a government think tank source proved to have the largest effect on the mark. In this case, nearly a 2-point increase. So for each, if they had one of these kind of resources in their citation, chances are it's going to be 2 points better than somebody who didn't. I mean, granted, you've got a huge number of caveats. This is just one essay, first-year essay. I'm sure people could do it better. But I think it is, as far as I know, the first time this has been done, we've actually tried to show that there is a link and that having some information, awareness, confidence, imagination, meant you got a better mark in your political science essay. So that was a relief, to be honest, from my perspective. I wasn't actually harming the students, or at least I was making sure that their essays were being produced in a way that at least got them decent marks from the various markers. I wasn't involved in any of the marking, by the way, so it's not me. It's not me. It was somebody else. So, I thought that was quite interesting. The next one we did, again asking a relatively straightforward question. Who teaches information literacy in the political science classroom? This was prompted by that Vista article I mentioned before. And there was that particular comment which is criticising the way that information literacy is taught, and has been taught in most universities. This kind of learning has no specific place in the curriculum. It's everywhere and nowhere. It's everyone's job, but nobody's responsibility. Those are Pfister's words. Quite damning, and, to be honest, So we wanted to find out whether FIS was right or not. And so what did we do? I say we again, slightly generously to me. We sent a survey to nearly 3,000 political scientists throughout the world. Basically, almost everybody on the university website in a politics department. Mostly Americans, obviously, but from all over. Okay, our response rate wasn't tremendous. It's better than pointless by 101 responses. And Doug tells me that's fine. And who am I to argue? What they did find? Well, our findings were that FISTA was by and large on the money here. Obviously, there is the people likely responding to this were likely to be interested in this in the first place, so that's skewed. But even then, most thought there was a problem that needed to be addressed. Most of these political scientists. I'm using political scientists because it's mostly Americans this time around. Most reckon there is a problem. Most reckon that it hadn't got any better. But only a minority said that they provided at least one dedicated session on the topic in their modules. Nearly 44%, but it's still a minority. We asked whether a librarian had been invited into a class, and only 27.5% had done so. We asked whether the staff themselves had been involved in any information literacy training. And again, it was only a minority. 46% this time. So that gives us some understanding of what's going on in the political science classroom. Again, I don't think this has been done before. It's not brilliant, it's not wonderful research, but it's a start, I think. And I think we're asking interesting questions. I hope so, anyway. Right. Sneaky peek at the next one that we're doing, which will be, as Rebecca mentioned, out next year, by which time it will be largely out of date, because most of the research was done before ChatGPT and all that. But again, we asked a simple question, but an interesting one. Do postgraduate students possess enough information literacy to thrive in that particular environment, the environment of a postgraduate student? And again, you would hope they should, because they have graduated. And in order to graduate, you have to fulfill various attributes, QAA, and a lot of them are related to information skills, information literacy. But have they? Have they really? So we sent another survey out, not quite as ambitiously this time, just to all the PGT master's students, effectively, in my institution here in Cardiff. I say all the politics master's students, not the entire university. Cardiff in my case, Salzburg by this stage for Doug, because he'd moved on. So 47 respondents this time, which is a 20% response rate. Usual mix of qualitative and quantitative questions, or questions that ask for qualitative or quantitative responses. And in some cases, our findings suggested a bit of relief in many cases that, many, or at least some PGT students are equipped, we think, looking at their responses, to tackle the various fiendish information challenges that will face them as postgrads. In particular, there were some sophisticated responses to questions about strategies for evaluating information online is suitable for their academic work. However, it's got to be said that these responses brimming with information confidence were a minority. About that particular question regarding information strategies, only a few had something approaching a strategy similar to, say, that of Jim Capoon. And rather, they tended to respond with a few words simply about the credibility of a website or the author. Quite a few left it blank. Quite a few just wrote unsure. And obviously, we asked other questions as well. But by and large, I think our main finding was, yep, some are great. Well, they're all great. Of course, they're all great. But in terms of their information literacy and being able to really cope in that environment, I think we simply cannot assume that a PGT student, a master's student, is likely to be any more information competent, savvy, if you will, than a regular undergraduate. It's also noticeable that only a minority of PGT students could remember having any explicit information literacy education. They probably were having it, obviously implicitly, but they couldn't remember. And another interesting stroke alarming finding was that some of the qualitative responses suggested that the emulation of academic staff was a relatively common strategy amongst PGT students hoping to improve their information literacy. One response to a question regarding the website the students tended to use most got the reply, Google Scholar. Oddly enough, most responses to that question didn't actually come up with a website. The two most popular were Google Scholar. Do you want to guess? JSTOR. Why? It is widely recommended by most of my professors. Responses to a different question about a website they would never use, in this instance, in their academic work, also suggested the influence of professors. This is a few years ago, but guess which website was identified? There was actually only two that were identified by, well, there were two sources that were identified by more than two students. Wikipedia, yeah. The other one was the Daily Mail, by the way. But yeah, an incredible 64.1% of the students pinpointed Wikipedia as the never-used website. But many of the answers actually suggested attention. One ran, Wikipedia. I mean, I think it is good to get an overview, but profs didn't want us to use it for papers. And here's another one from, I think, clearly a particularly astute student. Wikipedia. I always use it, but never cite it. Not because I distrust it, but just because academics don't like it. I might find some info on there and attribute it to a book. Well, I hope they did well. That was good. So yeah, again, I don't think the research is particularly groundbreaking in any sense, but I hope we're asking some interesting questions and getting some really interesting responses in return. And it keeps me amused, at least. Keeps the light burning, if you will. And moving from beyond the personal, I think there are other reasons to see some light at the end of the tunnel, for those of us doing political science at least. There is increased signs of life in information literacy in the political science pedagogy literature. So yeah, those are just two examples, Harden and Hard and Devine et al. I think a particularly interesting development is this book here that you can see about Matthew Schultz and Sweet Cushman. This is a general textbook about teaching, well, as you can see here, American government and politics. And it really goes to town on information literacy. They prefer the term information competence, I guess. But it goes throughout the book. There's an entire chapter called When Can We Trust Political Information? And it is co-written with a librarian. So I think there are signs. But I think it is telling that all those sources are from the US. I still find it easier to get mine and Doug's work published in the US. I can get it into one or two journals in the UK, but they're always pedagogy focused rather than political science focused. So I think we're a bit behind the times, but then again, there's clearly a reason for that. Events in the US. I don't need to dwell on this, I don't think. But they've clearly shattered assumptions about the very nature of political information. And I guess, for those not supporters of the MAGA movement, there isn't that much of an upside to this, other than it has clearly raised questions about the very nature of information. Dare I say it, truth? Probably not, but anyway. It's certainly pushing up the pedagogy agenda. And I've not talked about it thus far, and I'm not going to talk about it very much, and I know there's some papers to look forward to all about this from people who know far, far more than me. But obviously we're now in a new world, ChatGPT and so forth. What I would say is that I've never seen any one innovation scare the bejesus out of academics so much as this. And clearly, seemingly at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a common response to this. Just ban it was the response of one of my normally more rational colleagues when I broached the topic recently. But again, maybe this represents a window of opportunity for you to point to people like me in a more sensible direction, one informed by the tenets of that rather battered, yet still vital concept that I think brings us all here today. So thank you.